Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Falcon Focus. I'm your host, Vaughn Purdy, Director of Community Engagement with Simmons College of Kentucky. With me this week is Reverend Jason Crosby with Crescent Hill Baptist Church. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Vaughn. It's always wonderful to be with Simmons Nation.
Yes, thank you for being here. We're going to get right into it. We have so much going on here at Simmons College of Kentucky. And what I want to talk to you about today is your involvement with Simmons College of Kentucky, how you found out about Simmons College of Kentucky, and what initiative you work on or have been volunteering with here at Simmons.
Wonderful. Well, the primary point of connection that I've had with Simmons College is through an entity that's affiliated with Simmons known as Empower West Louisville. Empower West meets every Monday at noon for lunch at Simmons in the administrative building at 4th in Kentucky.
Yep.
And this is a group that's primarily comprised of black pastors and white pastors from various neighborhoods and communities that are within the larger Louisville community. And we've been meeting on Mondays regularly, faithfully, nearly every single Monday, so long as there's not perhaps a Simmons meeting, a Simmons board meeting that might arise, since June of 2015.
Wow, 5 years now.
5 years,
Yeah.
5 years.
So how did this partnership come about?
Well, and this is germane to what we'll discuss later together. This group of pastors were intentional about meeting following the murders, the shootings, the killings that took place at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina in June of 2015. In the wake of that travesty and tragedy, excuse me, in the wake of that event, a group of pastors who had some affiliation and relationship with one another prior made a determination and decision that we needed to get together to, one, build relationship with each other, but then two, do the work that needed to be done in our community to bring about racial reconciliation. And we have engaged in a variety of activities over the course of the past 5 years to do the best that we can do as faith leaders to make that a reality in our community.
Okay, well, now that you've teased the audience, there's so many initiatives that you all have done. Can you tell us particularly which ones come to mind? Because we have developed all sorts of partnerships that you say. You all have been vocal in the community with your stance with Simmons College of Kentucky, and you all have created these book reads that take place quarterly. Can you tell us more about those?
Sure. Let me get to the book read later, since we have one coming up very soon. But let me just share with folks some of what we've done that goes beyond the citywide book clubs that we have hosted. One way that we have, as a collective, been involved with Simmons is by encouraging members of our congregations to engage with Simmons in whatever capacity they are able. As you mentioned, I'm the pastor at Crescent Hill Baptist Church, which is a predominantly white congregation. And over the course of the past 5 years, one way that we have, as our church and as members at Crescent Hill, we've engaged in Simmons is by ways as simple as coming to basketball games here at the St. Stephen Family Life Center to cheer on the Falcons. That's become one ongoing tradition that's a part of our congregation now. And then a step beyond that is that there's a sizable number of folks at Crescent Hill that have engaged with students at Simmons, that have been encouragers to students. We've worked with administrators at Simmons to link individuals at Crescent Hill, with Simmons students, just to be in relationship.
Right.
To be a source of support and encouragement for Simmons students, principally students here at Simmons that have come from places beyond Louisville that may not have family here. And so that's one way that folks at Crescent Hill have connected. Another way that Empower West and Simmons have worked together to bring about change, not only in our community but around the country, is via our engagement with the West Louisville Forums,
Right,
for instance.
exactly, yes.
Empower West has not always spearheaded those efforts, but those monthly opportunities for education, for growth that Simmons hosts, Empower West has helped champion those monthly events.
And I want to add to our audience, we do those once a month, as Reverend Crosby just said, and we have been doing those for a very, very long 4 years now.
I believe so.
And so those are our way of pouring into the community various topics, subjects that impact the Black community and help us bring change and acknowledgement to the plight of this community.
Absolutely, yes. And in one way that the white pastors who are part of Empower West are involved in that is by making sure the word gets out to our white congregations. Because one thing we've seen through the West Louisville Forums is that by being able to tap into what is offered there, it is pretty remarkable, the depth and breadth of the education that takes place via those forums. And so Simmons hosts that. Yeah. Empower West then is a bridge that helps that kind of information and education get into the hands, into the hearts, into the minds of people in the white community here in Louisville and beyond. And then aside from the book club, one other thing I'd add is that we've been engaged in advocacy.
Right.
Dr. Cosby a couple years ago was stopped by Louisville Police, and Empower West was able to be a established group that was able to advocate alongside other Black leaders, Dr. Cosby, to say, there was something that just wasn't quite right about what went down in terms of that particular traffic stop. And so we've engaged in advocacy at the local level, but then on the national level as well. Again, our work with the Angela Project to push reparations to the forefront of the conversation locally and nationally, politically and religious circles is another component of some of the work that we've been doing via Empower West.
And as you know, we have a lot of situation going on here in Louisville that deals with justice for Breonna Taylor. Have you all been involved with that at all?
Yeah, we certainly have been. As we've met on Mondays, that has been a topic of our conversation, and we have been thinking strategically about ways that we can contribute positively to justice. Right. One thing that we have committed ourselves to at Empower West is understanding that individual situations, like the one Dr. Cosby faced, like the tragedy that has been the situation with Breonna Taylor, David McEntee. Yeah. One thing that we do is help people put that into the broader context that is systemic racism and the historical roots of the systemic racist systems that operate and are at play to this very day.
Right. Would you say you've been getting pushback of sorts, or how's your congregations and your group been brought along to some of the messaging that's out there and some of the thinking, if you will, of people in the minority community?
That's a great question. Very fortunate that at Crescent Hill there is a long history of at least being open to listening to other voices, particularly when it comes to issues of race in America. Okay. Many of my predecessors at Crescent Hill laid the foundation, the groundwork upon which I now stand, and established a culture of sorts that has given people an advantage at Crescent Hill to be able and willing to engage in these conversations. I know that's not always the case in other white churches, in other white communities. But I'm fortunate that I'm in a place where people already come into the conversation being willing to listen and learn.
Good.
With that said, it's not always easy even then, because much of what I have learned, much of what others at Crescent Hill have learned, have challenged those of us who thought that we were on the right track when it comes to racial justice and doing this kind of work. We have learned that we have not always been hitting the target. And sometimes some of what we thought we were doing that was helpful has been detrimental.
Okay. So can you tell us when you may have come to your first epiphany, if you will, listening to maybe Dr. Cosby or some of the other speakers talk during the Empower West meetings?
Well, certainly the Empower West meetings have been illuminating. In addition to initially gathering to build relationship, we gathered to study and learn.
Okay.
And one of the first books that we read together, just around that table, was Stokely Carmichael's Black Power. And that certainly was a moment during which the scales fell from my eyes. And one of the first epiphanies that I had is in that book, Carmichael talks about the suspicion that black people should have when entering into coalition, the suspicion of coalition. And that any time that black folks are engaging in those coalitions, oftentimes what happens is that an agenda or a justice claim that is unique to the black experience in America often moves to the bottom of the list. And that was one moment that got me thinking. But another moment is connected to the book club.
Okay.
The first book that we encouraged people across the city to read was Edward Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told.
I remember that.
This is the 5th year that we will be hosting a citywide book club. But the first year, when we read Edward Baptist's book, which is a book that in great detail documents the way in which the economy of the United States was genuinely built upon the institution of slavery, not just because of the cotton production, but because of the financial markets that developed via slave trading. People had to take out loans. Those loans then generated interest for those that were providing the financing. And so it wasn't just the cotton that was produced, it was the entire financial system. And from there, that was really the backbone upon which the U.S. economy was jump-started. So to see the money that was amassed at that point in time, and then to see how generationally wealth in white communities was passed along through the 20th century, how the middle class was built, in all of the ways in which that money was connected to slavery, and how black people, obviously through slavery, but then during the era of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and so forth, were kept out of that stream of resources. Was another moment that was an epiphany for me that came through the book club.
Good. How many members are in the Empower West Book Club? How many churches would you say you have?
Well, around the table on a weekly basis, Simmons brings together roughly 12 to 15 representatives from various churches.
Okay.
But one thing that's really fascinating about the book club, and this began even before COVID times, was that we've been recording and live streaming these events for several years now. And so we've been able to connect with people literally all across the country. In past years, we've had folks in Georgia and Texas, in Washington, D.C. I got a message yesterday from a friend of mine who is a pastor in Maryland who told me that she'll be tuning in next week for our latest version of the book club. So we have these churches locally, but because of the connections that Simmons has, that Dr. Cosby has, literally across the country, not only with predominantly black denominations and individuals, but now via Empower West, we have connections with the Presbyterian Church USA, the predominantly Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is another national, predominantly white denomination that will be promoting the book club this year, and others.
The NBCA is one of our partners as well.
Absolutely.
So we have a lot of partnerships going on. Well, I guess we should delve into this book read.
Absolutely.
And what's coming up. Would you like to talk a little bit more about past book reads, that have some titles that we talked about? Let our audience know that you have looked at various book titles and some of the authors who have come face to face. One of the benefits of pre-COVID, we were able to get together at Reverend Crosby's church and actually have a big gathering. We've had crowds there of up to 700 people. Yeah. And we had different authors come, and then they do Q&A sessions afterwards and sign their books. So we've been really successful with that. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the titles and people who have been here? Because I can't quite recall.
Absolutely. Well, the first was Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, which is, it's a difficult book on many levels. I mean, it is a rigorous historical study. Yeah. So it's dense, and then obviously the subject matter is jarring for all who read it. Then we had Richard Rothstein join us, the author of the book, The Color of Law. And what he really does in that book is he traces the ways in which systemically redlining was manufactured and put in place via our legal codes at various levels. Then we had Carol Washington join us, who wrote a book about a woman who was a slave of the Washingtons and her escape, and that shed light on the ways in which those who were some of our founding fathers and those families had relationships with slaves and their desire and their pursuit of this slave who escaped. Then we had an author named Mirza Baradadon who wrote the book The Color of Money, and she did a fantastic job in that book of talking about the ways in which U.S. financial systems have been structured to preclude access to capital, to loans, by black individuals and black businesses. And now this year we're grateful that we have the author Robert P. Jones, who will be with us. He wrote this book, White Too Long.
I actually have my copy as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
I borrowed it a couple of weeks ago and only read a little bit of it, but it's riveting, the part that I've read already. It's a eye-opening.
Yeah, well, one thing that Jones does in this book and that is unique to some of the previous reads that we've had is Jones really looks at the history of the white church and white theology in the United States in the days leading up to the Civil War, during the Civil War, Reconstruction into the 20th century. And he makes a compelling case and is one, like Jones, who was raised in a white Southern Baptist church and culture. I say amen to his historical analysis as well as what he shares about his own personal experiences. And I guess in a nutshell, what he does is he illuminates the ways in which the message of Jesus has largely been co-opted in terms of practice in white churches throughout the history of the white church in the United States. And that by and large, the teachings of Jesus have been oppressed or repressed in service of a theology and church practice that really advances white supremacy and at the very least. And so he makes a very compelling case. And I think one of the strongest points he makes, in addition to his historical study, is that he is a sociologist by trade. And so he's done some rigorous social science research and data gathering that looks at, in the United States now, what are indicators of racist attitudes. And one of the conclusions he reaches, based upon contemporary research and data collection that's done just in the past couple years, is that one of the primary predictors as to whether or not a person is racist is whether or not they attend a white church. Fascinatingly, what he discovered is that church attendance makes no difference.
Right.
I think one thing we'd like to think, perhaps all of us, white and black, is that if you go to church, some of your embedded and ingrained sins would be uprooted.
Right.
What he proposes in his conclusion, based upon his research, is that church attendance doesn't make a difference. In fact, the data tends to show that the more white people go to white churches, the more deeply ingrained in 2020. We're not talking about 1820, we're not talking about 19, this is 2020. The more deeply ingrained racist perspectives are, both at an individual level and how people understand the systems in which we're operating.
Okay. Yeah. So part of what he's going to do when he does this virtual event, which is coming up October 13th, he's going to talk about his book, and hopefully he'll talk about the reason he thought to look into this topic. Will he be asked questions about the relevancy of it today, why he looked into this particular issue, and what his hopes are for the future? Is there any way our society can become better as a result of this type of narrative?
Absolutely, and I hope that he will spend some time elaborating on that, because he is arguably one of the foremost authorities on race and how it functions within the white church in this current contemporary moment in which we find ourselves. So I don't want to steal all of his thunder, but I can say that he does wrap up his book by talking about the importance of understanding in the fuller context the history, both in church history and the way that church history and church theology shape the world in which we live. Right. You know, in the 1800s, when Jefferson Davis announced secession from the Union in Montgomery, Alabama, right next to him in a chariot in Montgomery, when he made that proclamation, stood one other person, and that was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama, a man named Basil Manley Sr. Basil Manley Sr. was instrumental in helping found the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is located right here in Louisville, Kentucky. To this day, on the campus of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary stands a residence hall, I do believe, a prominent building on the campus that is known as Manley Hall, named after the Manley family. Exactly. And so this is not ancient history. This history continues to shape and inform churches, and then that theology informs
a new generation.
A new generation, whether they are involved with church or not, these theological concepts that get embedded within the broader culture shape the society in which we live, whether we realize it or not, to this day.
And we also talk about how the hour of church before COVID is one of the most segregated hours that we all spend, both in the white and the black church. We tend to be in churches where people look just like us, and we've done that for years and years and years. So what you all doing at your church through the book reads and through the Empire West is helping to bridge that gap that we all have with one another, where we have the racial divide in this country that needs to be worked on in a book like this. And your work with the Empire West is really, really making a difference in our space. How do you all see, are there other Empower West groups across the country? Have you all been able to impact people outside a little bit more definitely, if you will, so it sustains?
Well, that's another great question, Vaughn. We have certainly had conversation with individuals, white and black, in different communities that have talked to us about what we've done in the hopes of replicating this where they might be. And one thing that we've told folks is, I don't know if you can replicate what we have done via Empower West, perfectly.
Right.
There's some of the relationship dynamics, the energy, the leadership of Dr. Cosby, the fact that Simmons is such a wonderful partner that we can work with to make it happen, has really brought together a bunch of good ingredients to bake up a good cake.
Right.
I think we've stumbled upon lightning in a bottle, so to speak. But that doesn't mean it can't be done in other places.
Right.
It might have a little different flavor, but we have been working with folks. Dr. Jones actually talks about Empower West in the book. We have asked Southern Seminary, for instance, to consider, given their history in shaping racist theology, how are they going to repair some of the damage that's been done. And so we've been having those conversations around the Empower West table. So one way in which this is being heard across the country and beyond is right here through this book, for instance. And then I think another way that we're helping craft a narrative and help people engage in this conversation across the nation is by encouraging folks at the local level to have conversations regarding reparations. Recently in North Carolina, I believe it was Asheville. It may have been.
It's Asheville.
It was Asheville.
I'm from North Carolina, so I think it's
Okay.
Asheville.
And so the mayor of Asheville began encouraging that city to consider exploring what reparations at the local level might look like. So we're learning from folks in Asheville. That's something we're interested in here, and we're trying to learn from folks there, and people in places like that are learning from us. So it's happening. It's happening.
It is happening. We hear it on the political spectrum. We hear it in states like California and New York. So we hear these different initiatives. So it's wonderful to be a part of these conversations. And as Simmons College of Kentucky and Empower West are on the forefront of these discussions. And of course, our president and pastor, Reverend Dr. Cosby, has been a big voice in the reparations discussion. So
Absolutely.
What do you see in the future for Empower West? What do you all, you do book reads, but you also do other things. What do you see in the next, can you believe 2020 is almost over? We're in October.
Well,
but what do you see in the next 2020 to 2021 that you all will be doing? You're still...
Well, I think that we'll continue to do what has proven to be successful thus far.
Yeah.
We will have some centerpieces, such as book reads, such as the West Louisville Forum, that we'll do in conjunction with Simmons. We're going to continue to encourage folks to engage with Simmons, to consider financial contributions to Simmons, to get to know Simmons students, faculty, staff. We'll do all that. I think what's on the horizon next will be ways in which a group like Empower West can partner with Simmons to help bring forward HB 40 in Congress.
Okay. It's a good one.
That is a proposal to just begin a national conversation about reparations.
Right.
As we've gone through some of the Angela projects, as we've learned more about the ADOS movement, the American Descendants of Slaves movement, as we've engaged with Simmons, I really think that the time is growing ripe for a group like Empower West to work with Simmons to advocate for that conversation at a national level.
That is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, we talked about a lot here today. We thank you for joining me on the show today.
What a pleasure.
Thank you again for joining me on this week's edition of Falcon Focus. Be safe.
Just yesterday, Southern Seminary voted money to let black students have scholarships to attend Southern Seminary, but has ignored the calls to give of its wealth to black-led institutions. What must